Ethical social media is a concern, and it's closely related to how technologies are adopted for people with disabilities. In fact, some of the most innovative applications of social media technologies exist in this area as users that may not have perfect sight, hearing, or mobility, for example, reappropriate its use for their benefit. A simple example is a deaf person using a messaging app, through to voice-activated technologies and mobility apps. People with disabilities are now also just as likely to take part in broader communicative activities through platforms available to all users, challenging the once othered boundaries. Professor Gerard Goggin from the Department of Media and Communication at the University of Sydney is one of the leading scholars within media and disability, and he spoke with me about some of the key issues within social media and people with disabilities.
The disability social media landscape is a really rich place at the moment. I think what's happened is that people with disabilities around the world have latched onto computers in the 80s and latched onto things like mobile phones in the 90s, websites when they've become accessible, and then took up things like blogging when blogging came along in the 2000s. And now I think what you see is this coming home to roost with things like Facebook, for instance, which is a relatively easy to use medium for many people, very much part of people's everyday life. And I think for people with disabilities has become an alternative platform. Because I suppose one of the overarching issues is that in our society, like a lot of issues around difference and diversity and who we are and who we might be, disability has been associated with being a problem. Disability's been a tragedy. We're better off dead than disabled. None of us want to acquire a significant impairment. So this has percolated through the media. And so you still find that a lot of mainstream media, the representations around disability are often very narrow. So with social media platforms, we have the opportunity for people to, in say the words of YouTube, you broadcast yourself. So we see with the rise of things like podcasting and YouTube, we see people with disabilities getting online and producing their own media. We see deaf people using video blogging or vlogging, where they can actually broadcast and make media in their own native language, so to speak, in sign language. So this is quite a landscape, I suppose, with a whole lot of different aspects to it, where you see real kind of interesting cultures of use of people with disability emerging that are specific to particular kinds of social media platform, but added up, I think, provide a real opportunity for a whole range of people to talk about disability or to just go on with life. So there's two meanings you might think of access. So I suppose the first meaning is the technology accessible for everyone to use? Classic example is the website. So we know that you can code websites so that software can read them out for blind people. You think of the Siri operating system on an Apple phone, can read out things to you. Now it turns out that despite 20 years of trying, a lot of websites are still inaccessible. Government websites, for instance, which is a bit of a travesty. So that's, I suppose, one obvious sense of access. The second sense, which is deeply connected, is the broader sense of can people really participate in, say, social media to the full extent that they wish to do so. This requires that first sense of, are the tools accessible? But then it also then requires, do people have the knowledge, the literacy to use them? Do they have the resources where, often people are expecting quality content, highly edited and curated content on social media platforms. I think one of the really powerful things that's emerged with social media and disability is this possibility of using it as a platform for things like comedy, for things like disability culture, that provides windows into disability community and bridges into other worlds as well. So disability comedy has been a great area because I suppose you've had a lot now are quite a tradition of comedians with disability. It's often a way that people address attitudes, and in Australia we have the great example of Stella Young, who was one of our famous comedians, broadcasters, and really a social kind of commentator. And through a TEDx talk she did, so some video that's available on the internet, and then gets circulated, it's probably one of the most shared pieces of content. And you can see this real potential for what you've got there is innovative content that previously wasn't very well known about, or was seen as kind of a specialised or a special area, disability content. Now, it's being used by people to actually upload it, to actually share it, to use the platforms to create content. And this is an area where we could really provide some support and direct some resources to make actually, much better, make it easier for people to share this content, make it easier for the content to then find its way into other forms of media, while still very much, having the credit and direction and shaping of people with disabilities. Now you really find people very empowered, younger people with disabilities feeling comfortable with the technology, and even in the last 5 years with smartphones, with iPads, having apps that provide better access, and really feeling that these are the kind of tools that they can use to tell their stories in ways that weren't possible before, to create content, to intervene, to actually be able to make a difference in the ways they want. So I think some of the ethical considerations for content producers relate firstly to bearing in mind the question of access, so that to make sure that the content is accessible, presented in different formats for people with a range of different expectations and abilities to be able to actually understand that content, to be able to interact with it. So that's the first thing. I suppose the second thing is to be able to actually get that broader sense of access, to give access to the experiences of people with disabilities around social media. And I think this is really crucial, because one of the key things in disability, like other areas, is nothing about us without us. So the adage that the people with disabilities should have the opportunity to provide that content themselves. So I think this, and with social media, this is entirely possible, that you can actually acknowledge the content that people with disabilities are already creating, and to engage in the discussions with people to say, well, we think that content's really interesting. Would you like to produce something else? Could we reuse that? So I think that's a kind of second thing. And then I suppose the third thing is the aspect of ensuring that, where as much as possible, people with disabilities are engaged in the conversations that social media affords. And I think this has been one of the ways that social media has been used by people with disabilities as a kind of feedback channel. And I think that when thinking about content for social media and the ethical aspects of this, just acknowledging the possibilities, just trying to think through the ways in which the opportunities are there, if people want to engage everyone theoretically in it, but particularly people with disabilities, is really important. So, if you're a content producer and looking at producing content for social media, I think the first thing is that there's a stack of material out there now. So there's lots of exciting, interesting, provocative and engaging content around disability. And the first step, I think, is to actually check it out, to have a look at some of the content. I think the second thing is to engage people with disabilities around it, that there's the opportunity to actually get in touch with people who are making some of the content, people with disabilities who are engaged around content, to have conversations with them to see if they're interested. And that might vary. That one of the kind of flashpoint issues recently has been the ethical issue, with the US website The Mighty, has been the allegation that they've been harvesting content from people with disabilities, just taken off the internet without paying them properly for it or attributing them. And so that clearly is a big ethical issue that we wouldn't want to get, to adopt that kind of practice. So I think that cues us just saying, well, there's as a social media content producer, to be in touch with people. People are often very open about collaborations. They're often very open about sharing the material if they're approached in an appropriate way, and often appreciative of the effort people to put in to say, yeah, we understand that you've produced relevant content. And it might be content also that's not just about disability per se, but it's really interesting content that's produced by producers who happen to have a disability. So I think that kind of openness, willingness to engage is really crucial.
What's interesting from Professor Goggins' point of view is how technologies are reappropriated for particular subcultures of users. We see this in other areas of social media, but perhaps with less of an immediate impact, let alone a crucial communication affordance. Professor Goggins' point about ethical considerations in how social media is constructed and deployed is salient, and is something all social media producers should be aware of when producing not only platforms and apps, but content also.